The wind howled through the narrow alleyways of London's fog-shrouded streets as a single figure stood in the shadows, clutching a letter sealed with a mysterious blue ribbon. The words inside promised to unveil a secret buried for centuries, one that could change everything. But as the clock struck midnight, the figure disappeared into the mist, and the truth slipped deeper into darkness. What had they found? And who was willing to kill to keep it hidden? Curious to know the truth behind the secrets? Stay with us as the mystery unfolds. Like, share, and subscribe to uncover the final pieces of this twisted puzzle. Chapter 1. A Curious Invitation. It was a morning like no other. The soft hum of London filled the air, the distant sound of carriages rolling along cobblestone streets, blending with the chirping of sparrows in the trees. In the heart of the city, at his modest yet elegantly furnished flat, Hercule Poirot sat in his favorite chair, sipping his morning coffee and carefully perusing the newspaper. His sharp eyes, always alert for the faintest anomaly, scanned the page with typical precision. Yet it was not the news that caught his attention that morning, but rather the envelope that lay before him. The envelope was not one that appeared frequently on his doorstep. Its seal was an elaborate design, dark and rich, reminiscent of velvet, and it was tied with a ribbon of the deepest blue. Poirot's curiosity, already piqued by the unusual appearance, deepened as he inspected the letter. His name was written in elegant script, with the same precision and care that a master artist might use to etch a perfect line. The sender's name, Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, was equally intriguing. A woman of considerable wealth and influence, Mrs. Hartley was known for her grandeur, her vast collection of fine art, and most notably, her unspoken past. Poirot, ever the cautious investigator, broke the seal with care, avoiding the temptation to rip it hastily. Inside, the paper was thick, heavy with age, and smelled faintly of lavender. The invitation itself, written in a beautifully flowing hand, beckoned Poirot to a gathering at Hartley's estate in the countryside. The purpose was unclear, though a reference to a rare family heirloom of significant historical value piqued Poirot's interest. The message was brief, yet charged with an undercurrent of mystery. Mrs. Hartley requested that Poirot personally attend, stating that his remarkable skills might be needed. Poirot's first instinct was to decline. He had not traveled to the countryside for quite some time, and his days were often filled with quieter, less engaging investigations. But then, his mind raced through the possibilities. The mention of a rare heirloom and the fact that Mrs. Hartley had gone out of her way to request his expertise suggested something more than a simple social gathering. No, Poirot's sharp mind knew that something deeper, something darker awaited him. His curiosity flared, though he was reluctant to admit it. An unseen force seemed to call to him. Mrs. Hartley's invitation was more than mere courtesy. It was an appeal to his instincts, a whisper of something hidden beneath the polished exterior. Poirot adjusted his bow tie, an air of determination settling over him. The journey was a pleasant one, though it did little to ease the tension building in Poirot's mind. As he traveled to the estate, the countryside unfolded before him, rolling hills and quaint cottages giving way to the looming silhouette of Hartley House in the distance. A place of elegant opulence, no doubt, but something about it felt isolating. The house sat like a brooding monolith, surrounded by an overgrown garden, its ivy-clad stone walls whispering secrets. Upon his arrival, Poirot was greeted with the utmost politeness by Mrs. Hartley's servants, yet he noticed a peculiar stillness in the air. The usual cheer of a country house party was absent, replaced by a quiet, almost oppressive atmosphere. The guests had already gathered in the drawing room, and Poirot was ushered inside, where Mrs. Hartley stood awaiting him. She was an imposing figure, tall and regal, her silver hair swept up into an elegant bun, her eyes dark and calculating. She welcomed Poirot with a warm but somewhat strained smile. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, in a voice as smooth as silk, "I am so pleased you could join us. I trust your journey was pleasant?" Poirot, though instinctively cautious, offered a polite smile in return. "It was an enjoyable ride, madame, though I confess your invitation piques my curiosity. What is it that requires my skills?" His eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room as he spoke, taking note of the other guests. There was Richard Valmont, the artist, his wild eyes betraying a mind ever in motion. Clarissa, his beautiful wife, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. Sir Cedric MacLeod, whose heavy presence hinted at both power and secrets, and several others, each more enigmatic than the last. Mrs. Hartley gestured to the center of the room, where a small, intricately carved box sat on a velvet cushion. It was a modest piece, no larger than a hand, yet there was something about it that drew Poirot's attention. The box was finely crafted, its wood polished to a gleam, but what struck Poirot was the ribbon that held it shut, blue velvet, matching the one tied around the letter. "This," Mrs. Hartley began, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is an heirloom passed down through my family for generations. A treasure hidden for so long that no one knows its true value or contents. It is said that only someone with the sharpest mind, a mind like yours, Monsieur Poirot, can unlock its secret." Poirot's eyes remained fixed on the box, and his mind raced. The box was clearly no ordinary family relic. There was a sense of significance to it, something beyond the material. It was an enigma wrapped in mystery, and Poirot could feel the first threads of the puzzle beginning to take shape. But something in Mrs. Hartley's words lingered in his mind. "Only someone with the sharpest mind." The phrase echoed in his thoughts, and Poirot's attention shifted to the guests in the room. It was clear that they too were intrigued, perhaps even more so than they let on. Each person present had their own motives, their own reasons for attending this gathering, but Poirot knew that beneath their polite facades lay secrets, secrets that were now entwined with this mysterious box. As the evening progressed, Poirot kept his observations sharp, his mind turning over every small detail. There was something undeniably off about the gathering, something more than mere curiosity about the heirloom. The tension in the room was palpable, like the calm before a storm. And Poirot, with his usual finesse, would soon uncover the quiet undercurrents of deception that ran deep within this gathering. The first pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Hercule Poirot's senses, always attuned to the faintest tremor in human nature, knew that this was just the beginning of a mystery far more complex than he could have imagined. Chapter 2. The puzzle begins. The following morning, the early light of dawn filtered through the tall windows of Hartley House, casting long, soft shadows across the grand drawing room. The guests had gathered in a semicircle around the small wooden box that had been placed on the velvet cushion in the center of the room. Mrs. Hartley stood, her back straight and poised, her eyes filled with an expectant gleam that was not entirely reassuring. The air in the room was still, the tension palpable, as if everyone present were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Poirot, ever the picture of calm, took his place in front of the box. He didn't rush. He never did. His movements were deliberate, each step measured, each glance taken with the precision of a jeweler examining a rare stone. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, waiting for his first words. He took a deep breath, his sharp eyes flicking from the box to the faces of those around him. Each person, he noted, wore an expression of feigned curiosity, but there was a deeper anxiety lurking beneath their poised exteriors. Mrs. Hartley's voice broke the silence, low and deliberate. "I believe you are the only one who can solve this, Monsieur Poirot. We have all tried, but the box resists every attempt." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the box. It was beautifully crafted, its dark wood smooth to the touch, the grain swirling in delicate patterns. There were no obvious signs of a lock, no hinges, no visible way to open it. He ran his fingers gently along its surface, his other hand adjusting his mustache, the tiny motion of his fingers betraying the sharpness of his mind already working. "Madame, I see that this box is not as simple as it appears," Poirot murmured. "It is not merely the design that fascinates me, but the absence of certain things, things that should be here, but are not." The room seemed to exhale as Poirot's words settled in, and the tension lifted slightly, though no one dared interrupt his methodical inspection. He turned the box over in his hands, inspecting every inch, even the underside. The guests watched in rapt silence, their expressions unreadable, though Poirot could sense the hidden eagerness in their eyes. It was clear that each one had their own theories, their own hopes, but none dared voice them. Not yet. Poirot's eyes flicked to the base of the box. He paused for a moment, running his fingers over the smooth wood, then slowly tilted it to catch the light. A faint glimmer caught his eye, something barely visible to the untrained eye, but to Poirot, it was as clear as day. There, beneath the polished surface, was an inscription, etched so faintly that it seemed almost a trick of the light. With a small but satisfied smile, Poirot leaned closer, carefully reading the Latin inscription aloud. "Veritas est in obliquo." A hush fell over the room. The words were familiar, yet their meaning was elusive. Mrs. Hartley raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp and attentive. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of unease. Poirot paused, letting the weight of the moment settle around him. "The truth lies in the oblique," he repeated, translating the Latin with deliberate calmness. The phrase resonated with a quiet profundity, almost philosophical in its ambiguity. The truth, it seemed, was hidden, not in the direct, but in the indirect, the hidden corners of perception. The room waited for his next words, the air thick with anticipation. Poirot continued, his voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of intrigue. "This inscription, it is not merely a clue, madame. It is a guide. We are not meant to look directly at the box to find its secret. No, we must look around it, at what is unseen, at what is hidden from immediate view. The truth is not here, but somewhere else." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. They were all aware now that Poirot's mind was already unraveling the mystery, and each of them could feel the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, like the tightening of a thread, pulling everyone closer into the web of intrigue. Poirot's hands hovered over the box again, his fingers brushing its smooth surface. Slowly, as though testing the weight of his words, he ran his finger along the edges of the box, feeling for anything unusual. His fingers paused, just for a moment, over a slightly raised ridge in the wood. It was so subtle that anyone else might have missed it, but Poirot's experienced touch immediately caught it. With a gentle but deliberate motion, he pressed on the ridge. To his surprise, it gave way with a soft click, like a hidden mechanism releasing. The box's lid did not immediately open, but a faint sound, almost imperceptible, reverberated through the air, like the breath of the box itself, exhaling after being held shut for so long. The guests, already on edge, shifted in their seats. Mrs. Hartley's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, but Poirot raised a hand, signaling for calm. He continued to manipulate the mechanism, his fingers pressing in a certain sequence that he knew instinctively would reveal the secret. With another soft click, the box slowly creaked open. But what lay inside was not a treasure or a trinket, but a small piece of blue velvet fabric, carefully folded and wrapped in a fine silk cloth. Poirot paused, his mind spinning with possibilities. The fabric seemed simple enough, but there was something about it. The way it was folded, the way it shimmered in the light, that made it impossible for him to ignore. He carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing the velvet fabric beneath. As he held it up, he saw that it was not merely a piece of fabric, but something much more intricate, an embroidered cipher, barely visible to the untrained eye, yet unmistakably a code. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. The guests had expected a fortune or some long-lost artifact, but this was something different. This was a puzzle hidden in plain sight, and Poirot could feel the weight of it pressing upon him. It was not a treasure that lay in the box, but a mystery, one that was intricately woven into the very fabric of the Hartley family history. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a slight smile. "Ah, madame, it seems we have much more to uncover than we first imagined." The guests shifted, their curiosity and apprehension mixing in equal measure. Poirot knew that they were all thinking the same thing. Who had hidden this cipher, and why? What was it that they were not meant to see? And most importantly, what did it all mean? But Poirot, ever the calm observer, knew this was only the beginning. The true puzzle had just begun to unravel, and he would need to tread carefully, for the stakes were higher than any of them realized. As he held the velvet fabric in his hands, Poirot's mind began to race with possibilities. The cipher was no ordinary puzzle. It was a key to a secret that had been buried for years. And he, Hercule Poirot, was the only one who could unlock it. But who, Poirot wondered, was waiting for him to do just that? Chapter 3. Secrets and Shadows. The drawing room, bathed in the soft light of the early afternoon, now felt heavy with expectation. Hercule Poirot stood, holding the small piece of blue velvet fabric between his fingers, his mind a whirl of possibilities. The embroidered cipher was not just a decorative flourish. It was a clue, one that seemed to pulse with significance, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The guests, still seated in the circle, watched him with a mixture of awe and unease. The air around them seemed to thicken, as if the very walls of the room had closed in, tightening with the tension that hung in the space. Poirot, however, remained calm, He had seen these moments before, the stillness that came just before the storm of revelation. It was a sensation he had come to recognize, and he knew, with the certainty only experience could bring, that he was standing at the precipice of something far more intricate than any of them could imagine. Poirot turned the velvet fabric in his hands, studying the intricate threads of the embroidery. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to his trained eye, it was an unmistakable pattern. The fabric was not simply woven. It had been designed with purpose, each thread telling a story that only the sharpest mind could unravel. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice soft yet steady, "this fabric, though seemingly insignificant, holds the key to our next step." He glanced at Mrs. Hartley, whose face had gone pale as she observed his careful examination of the cloth. "It is not the fabric itself that is of interest, but the cipher woven into it. It is a code, a message hidden in plain sight." The guests shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Mrs. Hartley's expression was unreadable, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her sleeve. It was clear she had known there was something more to the box than met the eye, but even she could not have anticipated this turn in the mystery. Poirot placed the fabric on the table before him, his eyes still locked on its delicate patterns. "The cipher is not just a puzzle," he continued, his voice low and deliberate. "It is a warning, a message not meant for our eyes, but for those who understand its meaning." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. The room seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint rustle of the fabric as Poirot's fingers brushed against it, as though he could feel the story it was telling. "This is no ordinary code," he added, his eyes flicking briefly to Richard Valmont, who had been unnervingly silent since the moment the box had been opened. The artist, who had been so eager to claim ownership of the box's secret, now seemed to shrink back into his seat, his eyes darting nervously from Poirot to the cloth. Poirot's gaze remained steady, his mind working rapidly to decipher the meaning behind the cryptic message. He could feel the tension in the room growing, the pressure of all those present weighing down on him, as if they were waiting for him to unlock the secret they all sought. Then, as if on cue, Poirot leaned closer, his sharp eyes catching a subtle detail in the pattern, an asymmetry that had not escaped his notice. He pressed his finger lightly on one of the threads, and with a small but satisfying click, the fabric gave way, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. The room gasped collectively. For a moment, Poirot allowed the silence to linger, the anticipation thick in the air. He lifted the fabric gently, revealing a small compartment embedded within the table itself, a compartment that had remained unnoticed by all until now. Inside, tucked carefully within a fold of the wooden surface, was a letter. The paper was old, its edges yellowed with age, and the ink, though faded, was still legible. Poirot unfolded the letter with reverence, his brow furrowing as he read the contents aloud, his voice quiet but resonant. "To the one who finds this, beware. What is hidden is not meant to be uncovered. The truth you seek is a shadow, and in shadows, betrayal lurks. Heed this warning, for the price of knowledge is steep, and some secrets are better left buried." Poirot's voice trailed off as he finished reading, his eyes never leaving the paper. The room was eerily silent. The letter, like the box, was more than it appeared. It was a message wrapped in caution, a dire warning to those who sought the truth. Mrs. Hartley's face, once composed, now betrayed a flicker of panic. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words seemed to elude her. She cast a glance at her guests, her eyes lingering for just a moment on Richard Valmont, whose fingers were nervously tapping on his chair. Poirot folded the letter carefully, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just read. The letter was a warning, but it was also an invitation, a challenge. Whoever had placed this letter inside the box had known that someone, someday, would uncover it. They had known that Poirot, with his unerring ability to discern the hidden truths of the world, would be the one to unlock its secrets. "The truth," Poirot murmured, "is indeed in the shadows. But now, we must decide whether we will walk into those shadows or whether we will turn back." The tension in the room was thick, like a storm cloud hanging low on the horizon. Each guest sat frozen, as though waiting for the first drop of rain to fall. The weight of the letter's message hung over them, its implications clear. There were forces at work here, forces that were not bound by the simple mechanics of a box and a cipher. No, this was something deeper, something far more dangerous. Poirot's gaze swept over the guests once more, his sharp eyes catching each of them in turn. He saw the flicker of unease in Richard's eyes, the subtle tension in Clarissa's posture, the nervous tapping of Sir Cedric's fingers. They were all hiding something, Poirot knew. But what? "Madame Hartley," Poirot said, his voice calm but unyielding. "I believe you are aware of more than you have told us. This letter, this warning, it comes from someone who knows your family's history, someone who understands the dangers that lie hidden in the shadows. I must ask you, who else besides you knew of this box's secret?" Mrs. Hartley took a deep breath, her composure slowly returning, though her eyes betrayed a hint of fear. I am not sure," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "There are things that are better left undisturbed." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "That is precisely why we must continue. For it is in those very things, the things left undisturbed, that the truth lies." As he spoke, Poirot could feel the shadows of doubt creeping into the room, casting their dark veil over the guests. The mystery was no longer about the box or the cipher. It was about trust and betrayal. The letter had set the stage for what was to come, but it was only a small part of the larger puzzle. And Poirot, ever the calm detective, knew that the deeper he dug, the darker the secrets would become. The mystery had only just begun, and Poirot was determined to see it through, no matter where it led. Chapter 4. A silent revelation. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a warm amber glow across the estate's grand drawing room, but the air was anything but warm. The room, once filled with idle chatter and polite murmurs, had now become thick with a palpable silence, as if the very walls of Hartley House had become spectators to the unfolding mystery. Poirot stood still, the letter clutched carefully in his hands, his sharp eyes narrowing as he considered the meaning of its words. The room, which had once seemed inviting, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets, each shadow hiding a hidden truth, each gleam of light revealing something sinister. The guests had all gathered at a distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity and unease, none daring to move, as if too afraid to interrupt the delicate moment. Mrs. Hartley, her face pale and drawn, remained silent, her eyes fixed on the letter in Poirot's hands. She had not spoken a word since Poirot read the cryptic message aloud. Her lips trembled slightly, as though struggling to find the courage to speak the truth that hung between them like a dark cloud. "Madame," Poirot said softly, his voice breaking the heavy silence, "I understand that this may be difficult, but I must ask you, what is it about this box, about this warning, that makes you so uneasy? You cannot keep hiding the truth from me." Mrs. Hartley hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her chair as though searching for some anchor to hold on to. For a long moment, the room remained still, every breath held in anticipation. Then slowly, Mrs. Hartley spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It is not just the box, Poirot," she began, her eyes flicking toward her guests, who seemed to be listening with a mixture of fear and fascination. "It is the legacy that comes with it, the secrets that have been buried in my family for generations. The truth is more dangerous than you realize." Poirot's brow furrowed. There was something in her voice, something in the way she spoke, that sent a chill through the room. The cryptic letter had only hinted at the danger. Now, Mrs. Hartley was confirming it. Whatever had been hidden inside the box was not just a family heirloom or a treasure. It was a key to something far more unsettling. "Perhaps it would be best if you told me everything, Madame," Poirot suggested, his voice soothing yet unyielding. He knew that silence would not solve the mystery, but the right words could coax the truth out of even the most guarded of hearts. Mrs. Hartley took a deep breath, and for a moment, Poirot thought she might speak. But instead, she stood and walked toward the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The guests, sensing that something was about to unfold, shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Poirot and Mrs. Hartley. Richard Valmont, the artist, was the most nervous. His eyes flickered constantly between the box, the letter, and the guests, as though calculating his next move. Finally, Mrs. Hartley turned to face them, her eyes weary but resolute. "This box," she began, her voice trembling, "was not always in my family's possession. It came to us in a most unusual way, a way that even I have never fully understood." Poirot's interest piqued, his gaze sharpening as he listened intently. "Go on, Madame." "My grandfather," she continued, "was a man of great ambition, but also of great secrecy. He had made many enemies in his pursuit of power, and he believed that this box held the key to something far more valuable than wealth. Some say it was a map, others believe it contained a treasure. But whatever it held, it was something that was never meant to be found." Poirot's eyes narrowed as he listened, sensing that the story was leading to something dark, something far more dangerous than a mere family heirloom. "Years ago," Mrs. Hartley continued, her voice now steadying, "my grandfather hid the box away, deep within the estate. He left a series of clues, thinking that one day someone worthy would find it. But the box was not meant to be discovered by just anyone." She paused, her gaze flicking briefly to Richard before returning to Poirot. "It was meant for someone with the mind to understand its message." Poirot, ever the perceptive detective, understood the implications of her words. "And you believe that one of your guests," he said softly, "has discovered these clues?" Mrs. Hartley nodded slowly, her face now shadowed with a grim expression. "Yes, and I fear they have learned more than they should have." The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening as the last rays of sunlight faded into dusk. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. Whoever had uncovered the clues had not done so by accident. It was clear now that the box held something far more dangerous than a simple treasure. But what? Clarissa Valmont, who had been quiet until now, shifted in her seat. Her face was pale, her fingers twisting nervously around the delicate lace of her gloves. But Mrs. Hartley, why keep the box locked away all these years? Why not tell us the truth? Mrs. Hartley's eyes darkened. Because the truth is more dangerous than you realize. My grandfather was not a man to be trusted, and neither was the person who entrusted him with the box. There are forces at work here, forces that are older than my family, older than anyone in this room. And if the wrong person gains control of the box, it could mean disaster. Poirot stepped closer to the table, his sharp eyes never leaving Mrs. Hartley's face. I see. So, you believe someone among us is trying to uncover these secrets, to use them for their own purposes? Mrs. Hartley's expression hardened, her voice low but filled with an unmistakable conviction. I know someone is trying to use it, and I believe it's one of you. Poirot's gaze flicked briefly around the room, taking in the reactions of the guests. Richard Valmont shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the door as though considering an escape. Sir Cedric MacLeod sat rigidly, his fingers tapping nervously on the arm of his chair. Clarissa's eyes, however, seemed focused solely on her husband, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she was fighting to keep something inside. Poirot turned back to Mrs. Hartley, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight of quiet authority. We must now confront the truth, madame. Who among your guests knew of the box's contents? Who among them has the most to gain from its discovery? Mrs. Hartley's face grew pale, her lips trembling. I don't know, she whispered, but I fear that by the time we find out, it will already be too late. Poirot nodded, his mind already turning over the new pieces of the puzzle. One thing was clear. The danger was not in the box itself, but in the race to uncover its secrets. Someone in the room had already begun to play a dangerous game, and the stakes were much higher than anyone had anticipated. Poirot's eyes glinted with resolve. Then we must act swiftly. The shadow is closing in, and it will not wait for us to find the truth. With those words, Poirot knew that the next step in this intricate dance of deception and mystery had begun. The question now was not who had the box, but who would control the secrets it held. And for that, Poirot would need to trust his instincts and the silence of the shadows. Chapter 5. A Web of Lies. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its gentle warmth contrasting sharply with the chill that had settled in the room. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls of the grand drawing room, and the quiet murmur of the wind outside seemed to add to the tension that hung thick in the air. A sense of foreboding wrapped itself around the guests like a cloak, each person aware that something was amiss, though none dared speak of it directly. Hercule Poirot sat near the edge of the room, his back straight and his eyes unfocused, as if lost in thought. His fingers lightly tapped against the side of his chair, a subtle rhythm that only he could feel. The room was still, save for the soft rustle of the firewood and the occasional creak of the old house settling. The guests had all taken their seats, but their minds were far from calm. Richard Valmont, the artist, had been unusually quiet. Clarissa, his wife, sat stiffly beside him, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames as though seeking something in the dance of the fire. Sir Cedric MacLeod, the wealthy industrialist, stared out the window, his hand twitching nervously as if he too sensed the storm approaching. Poirot's eyes never wavered from the group. He could feel the tension in the room, the slight shifts in posture, the quick glances exchanged between them. Everyone had a secret, and as much as they tried to conceal it, Poirot knew that all their secrets were beginning to unravel. A soft cough broke the silence. Mrs. Hartley, who had been standing by the window, turned and approached the center of the room, her face pale and drawn. The moment she spoke, her voice trembled, though she tried to steady herself. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her eyes meeting his with a mix of desperation and resolve, "I can no longer keep the truth hidden. The box, the cipher, they are not just pieces of a puzzle, but a part of something far darker." Poirot's gaze sharpened. He could see the strain in her eyes, the exhaustion that had crept into her features over the past few days. Something had changed within her, something that made her more willing to speak, to confront the darkness she had tried so hard to keep at bay. "It was my grandfather's obsession," Mrs. Hartley continued, her voice trembling as the weight of the revelation pressed down on her. "The box, the cipher, it all began with him. He was not just a man of power, but a man of influence, tied to forces that I could never fully understand." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze never leaving her. "Go on, madame." "My grandfather was a member of a secret society," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "A society that operated in the shadows, influencing politics, commerce, and even wars. They sought power in all its forms, and the box, it was meant to hold something far more valuable than a simple treasure. It was meant to hold control over those who dared to seek it." The room fell silent, save for the faint rustle of fabric as everyone shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The words "secret society" seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, clouding the minds of all who heard them. Poirot's mind raced as he absorbed the information. A secret society? What was this hidden power that Mrs. Hartley's grandfather had been involved with? And how did it tie into the box? "Who else knows of this society?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that seemed to cut through the tension. "Is it possible that one of your guests is involved?" Mrs. Hartley hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the others. I don't know," she said, her voice shaking. "But I fear that someone here does. I fear that someone has been using the box for their own gain." Poirot's eyes swept over the group. Richard Valmont, his face drawn and pale, looked away, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Clarissa, her eyes avoiding her husband's, shifted uncomfortably, as though trying to avoid the weight of Poirot's gaze. Sir Cedric, too, seemed uneasy, his fingers tapping rapidly on the armrest of his chair. It was then that Poirot's mind made a sudden connection. He had noticed, in the early days of the investigation, that there had been subtle signs of tension between the guests. Richard and Clarissa's strained relationship, Sir Cedric's nervous energy. But there was more to it than that. The box was not just an heirloom. It was a symbol, a key to something much greater. And those in the room were not merely curious guests. They were players in a far more intricate game. Poirot rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and calm. He turned to face each of the guests, his gaze lingering on each of them for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You are all tied to this mystery," he said, his voice low but steady. "But not all of you are innocent. One of you has a motive. One of you has been playing a dangerous game, and I will not rest until I uncover the truth." The guests shifted uneasily, their faces betraying the nervousness that had taken root within them. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the weight of Poirot's words hung over them. For the first time, the truth was becoming undeniable. They were all involved, each with their own secrets, their own lies. Richard Valmont was the first to break the silence. His voice was tight, almost desperate. "You don't know what you're talking about, Poirot. This box is nothing but a trinket, a silly game." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A game?" he repeated softly. "Do you truly believe that? Or are you simply trying to deflect attention from the truth?" Richard's eyes flicked to Clarissa, then back to Poirot. There was something in his gaze, something that revealed more than he intended. Poirot caught the briefest flicker of fear in Richard's eyes, a fear that was unmistakable. "You are hiding something, Monsieur Valmont," Poirot said, his voice calm but unwavering. "Something that goes beyond this box. What are you trying to protect?" Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment, it seemed as though he might collapse under the weight of Poirot's gaze. But then, with a final glance at Clarissa, he looked down at his hands, the fingers trembling slightly. I didn't want to be involved," Richard whispered, "but it's too late. It's already too far gone." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Poirot's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place. Richard had known more than he had let on. And what's more, he had been involved in something far darker than he had admitted. Poirot turned back to Mrs. Hartley, his expression calm but firm. "Madame, it is clear now that the box holds far more than you have led us to believe. But the truth is still shrouded in shadows. I must ask you, who else in your family was involved with this society? Who knew about the box?" Mrs. Hartley swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I don't know everything," she admitted. "But my grandfather's ties to the society were deeper than I ever understood. There were others involved, people from powerful families. They could be anyone in this room, or someone who is no longer here." The mystery had deepened. The box, the cipher, the warning. It was all part of a much larger web, and Poirot knew that the answers were within reach. But as always, the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Poirot paused, his eyes scanning the room one last time. "The web of lies is tightening around us," he murmured. "But I will not allow the truth to remain hidden. Not for long." And with that, the game had truly begun. Chapter 6. The Artist's Brush. The evening had settled deeper into its quiet rhythm, and the soft murmurs of the wind outside seemed like distant whispers against the more pressing silence of the room. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, its glow casting an ethereal warmth across the faces of those seated in the drawing room. However, the warmth of the flames did little to ease the tension that gripped the room. Hercule Poirot stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out into the darkening landscape. He had always found solace in stillness, a moment to center his thoughts. But tonight, the silence felt like a pressing weight. The group had been quieter than usual since the revelations in the previous chapter. Richard Valmont, the artist, seemed particularly withdrawn, his usual confidence and bravado replaced with an almost palpable unease. He had barely said a word since Poirot had confronted him with his lies. Clarissa Valmont, his wife, had her eyes locked firmly to the floor, avoiding any eye contact with her husband, and Sir Cedric MacLeod, though outwardly calm, had not hidden the anxiety that tightened his posture. Poirot, ever observant, noted the way Richard's eyes flitted nervously between his wife and the other guests, his fingers restless, almost as if they were itching to create, perhaps in a bid to escape the suffocating atmosphere of suspicion. The artist's mind, Poirot surmised, was no longer consumed by his canvas. No, tonight, Richard Valmont's thoughts were more fixated on something far darker. Poirot turned away from the window, the soft shuffle of his shoes on the rug, the only sound as he stepped back toward the group. The moment he did, every eye in the room followed him. They were all waiting for something, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to be revealed. He could sense their fear, though they each tried to maintain their composure. It was the kind of fear that didn't speak of physical harm, but of exposure, the fear that comes when a secret is about to be laid bare. "It seems," Poirot began, his voice low and measured, "that we are all playing a part in a game whose rules have not been made clear. But no one plays this game alone. All of you are connected, whether you wish to be or not." A shiver seemed to pass through the guests. Clarissa's lips tightened, but it was Richard who shifted most noticeably in his chair. His eyes flickered to his wife for the briefest moment, and Poirot did not miss the tension that passed between them. A silent conversation that said more than any words could. "Richard," Poirot said, his voice sharp but not unkind, "you have been quiet tonight. I wonder if it is because you know something that the rest of us do not." He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "It is no coincidence that you, an artist, have remained silent in the face of such pressing matters. I suspect you are waiting for the right moment, the right brush stroke, to reveal the truth." Richard flinched, but Poirot's gaze remained steady. There was no accusation in his tone, only an invitation to speak, a gentle prodding. The artist's fingers twitched at his side, and for a moment, Poirot saw a flash of something, fear, guilt, in his eyes, before it was quickly masked by an air of indifference. "No, Monsieur Poirot," Richard finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm not waiting for a moment to reveal anything. I've said nothing because there is nothing to say. You are wrong about me." Poirot smiled slightly, his expression serene but knowing. "Ah, Monsieur Valmont, that is the very problem, is it not? You say there is nothing, yet I see the way you clutch at your hands, the way you refuse to meet anyone's gaze. I see that you are hiding something beneath that calm facade." The room was still as Richard's face paled. His fingers twitched again, and for the first time, Poirot saw the artist truly falter. It was a crack in the armor, an imperfection that was impossible to hide. Clarissa's gaze shifted toward her husband, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Poirot caught the subtle flash of fear in her eyes as well. She too was hiding something. "Richard," Poirot said softly, his voice almost soothing, "you are a man who thrives on creation, on bringing beauty to life with your hands. But sometimes, an artist's greatest masterpiece is not a canvas or a sculpture. It is the illusion they create in the minds of others. And you, monsieur, have been painting a very particular illusion. But illusions cannot hold forever, and the truth always finds its way to the surface. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he faced Poirot with a mix of frustration and defiance. "What do you want from me, Poirot?" he demanded, his voice strained. "What do you think I am hiding? You've accused me of things that are not true. I am not involved in this conspiracy of secrets. I have nothing to do with it." Poirot remained calm, unfazed by the outburst. He looked at Richard for a long moment, reading him, analyzing every gesture, every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. The silence between them grew thick, and Poirot knew deep down that Richard was lying. The artist was hiding something, and it wasn't just his own involvement in the mystery that had Poirot's attention, but something much more personal. "Monsieur Valmont," Poirot said, his tone now more gentle, almost coaxing, "I believe you. I believe that you have nothing to do with the darker aspects of this story. But I also believe that you have painted yourself into a corner that now threatens to expose your most hidden secrets." Richard's jaw clenched, and his eyes flickered to his wife again. This time, however, his gaze lingered, as if seeking reassurance from her. She met his eyes with an unreadable expression, and for the first time, Poirot saw the smallest hint of something he had not noticed before, something that tied them together, a shared history that had yet to be uncovered. "Clarissa," Poirot said suddenly, his voice soft but direct, "I wonder if you might have something to add?" Clarissa flinched, her eyes widening in surprise, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady but betraying a hint of nervousness. Poirot's gaze held hers, unwavering. "You and your husband, Monsieur Valmont, you share a connection, a bond. It is clear to me that you both know more than you have let on, and that, madam, is where the mystery lies." The room was deathly still as all eyes turned to Clarissa. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightly clutching the armrest, but Poirot could see the way her lips trembled slightly, betraying her calm exterior. Richard, too, seemed to shrink into himself, his face drawn with a mix of regret and guilt. Poirot's voice broke the silence again, this time with a hint of finality. "The truth, Madame Valmont, is that you and your husband are not simply victims of circumstance. You are players in this game. You have been hiding something, and it is only a matter of time before it comes to light." Clarissa's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw a flash of panic flicker across her face before she regained control of her composure. She turned to Richard, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. Poirot smiled softly, the weight of his words settling in the room. He had no doubt now. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form, and he knew that the truth was closer than ever. But the artist's brush had already painted the scene, and now it was only a matter of time before the final strokes revealed the full picture. With the truth now hanging in the air, the mystery was far from over. But Poirot was ready. The web of lies was being unraveled, and the shadows that had clung to this house were starting to recede. Chapter 7. The betrayal revealed. The air in the drawing room had become thick, heavier than it had been before, as if the very atmosphere was bracing itself for something inevitable. Outside, The wind had risen, howling through the trees surrounding the Hartley estate, sending gusts of cold air through the cracks in the old wooden windows. Inside, though, the room was still, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire, which, though comforting, did little to warm the chill creeping in. Hercule Poirot stood by the window, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the night, contemplating the revelations of the last few hours. The guests, still uneasy after his piercing questions, had settled into an uncomfortable silence, each one lost in their own thoughts. But Poirot's mind was racing, as it always did when faced with a puzzle that was almost complete. Each movement in the room, every glance exchanged between the guests, told him more than words ever could. Richard Valmont, the artist, had broken. His facade of calm had cracked under the pressure. Clarissa, his wife, had shown her true colors as well. Guilt and fear danced behind her eyes, betraying the cool exterior she had carefully maintained. And Mrs. Hartley, poor, tormented Mrs. Hartley, was a woman caught in the web of her family's secrets, too afraid to confront the darkness that had plagued her ancestors for years. Poirot turned back from the window, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He knew what was coming. The final piece of the puzzle was within his grasp, and the time for gentle probing had passed. Now, it was time for the truth to be laid bare, for all the lies and deceit to be exposed, even if the revelation would shake the foundations of Hartley House itself. Mrs. Hartley, who had been standing near the fire, clasped her hands tightly together, her knuckles pale against her skin. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice quivering, "I fear that we are not the only ones caught in this web. There are others who have played their part in all of this, who have been pulling the strings from the shadows." Poirot took a step toward her, his presence calm but commanding. "Madame," he said softly, his voice steady, "you have known from the start that the box holds more than just family secrets. The box is a key, one that unlocks doors that should never have been opened. And now you must tell me, who else knows of this key? Who else is pulling the strings?" Mrs. Hartley's eyes dropped to the floor, and for a moment, she seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. Her lips trembled as though she were about to speak, but the words seemed to be caught in her throat. She glanced nervously at Richard and Clarissa, and Poirot saw the flicker of something dark, something unspoken, pass between them. The truth was on the edge of being exposed, and it was clear that the guests in the room were desperate to keep it buried. It was Richard who spoke first, his voice low but filled with desperation. "You don't understand, Poirot," he said, his hands clenched tightly in front of him. "The box. It's not just about us. It never was. There are forces far greater than us at play here. Powerful people who will stop at nothing to get what they want." Clarissa turned to face her husband, her face pale and stricken with fear. "Richard, please," she began, but her words trailed off as she met Poirot's unwavering gaze. Her voice cracked, and for the first time, she seemed to lose her composure completely. Poirot stepped closer to Richard, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "Who are these people, Monsieur Valmont?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Who are these powerful figures who seek to control the secrets of the box?" Richard's eyes darted to Clarissa again, but this time there was no comfort in her gaze, only a shared understanding, a shared fear. He turned back to Poirot, his face pale, his lips trembling. "I can't," he started, but the words faltered as though he could not bring himself to speak the truth. Poirot's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "You must speak, Monsieur Valmont. For your sake and for everyone's. There are no more lies left to tell." Clarissa, her hands trembling in her lap, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was never meant to be like this," she said, her eyes dark with shame. "Richard and I, we never meant to be involved in any of this, but we were caught up in it, in the web of power that my family was entangled in. My father, you see, he was involved with them, the society that Mrs. Hartley's grandfather was part of, and they knew the box was the key to more than just a treasure. It was the key to controlling the flow of information, to manipulating those in power." Poirot's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of realization crossing his face. "Your father, madame? Was he part of the secret society as well?" Clarissa nodded, her face pale. "Yes, he was a key figure in the society. And when he died, the box passed to me, through Richard's influence. He knew what it meant. He knew what the box could do, what it could unlock." The room fell into a heavy silence as Poirot absorbed this new information. The society had not just sought power for personal gain, they had sought to control the world's power, to hold the keys to influence and manipulation. The box was more than a mere object. It was the symbol of their control. And Richard and Clarissa, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had become part of this dark game. Poirot turned to Mrs. Hartley, his voice now steady and resolute. "And you, Madame Hartley. Your grandfather was the one who set this in motion. But what of you? Why did you wait so long to reveal the truth?" Mrs. Hartley's face was shadowed with guilt. She took a slow, shuddering breath before answering. "I did not know, Poirot. Not until recently. But when I saw Richard and Clarissa, I realized they had already been drawn into the game. I feared that they might be the ones who were being used to bring the box back into the fold of the society. I thought that if I kept the secret hidden, I could protect them, protect us all from the danger that would follow." Poirot's face softened, but his voice remained firm. "The danger is already here, madam. The lies have been spun too tightly. But now, we must confront the truth, no matter how painful." The fire crackled once more, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, as though the house itself was exhaling the tension that had built up over the past days. Poirot looked at each of the guests, his eyes lingering on Richard, Clarissa, and Mrs. Hartley. They were no longer hiding from the truth. It had been laid bare, and with it came the inevitable realization that they were all tangled in a web that none of them had fully understood. "The betrayal," Poirot said softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve, "is not just in the secrets we have kept, but in the choices we have made. The society, those who seek to control power, have used us all. And now, it is time for us to take control of our own fate." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them like a shroud. The truth had been revealed, but the mystery was far from over. There were still forces at work, forces that would stop at nothing to claim the box for themselves. But Poirot knew this much. The final chapter was yet to come, and he would not rest until the last thread of the web was unraveled. As the shadows deepened outside, Poirot knew that the true battle was about to begin. The game of secrets, lies, and betrayal had only just reached its most dangerous phase. Chapter 8. The Quiet Resolve. The night had deepened around Hartley House, the once vibrant garden now shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, eerie shadows across the grounds. The wind had died down to a soft murmur, and the moon hung low in the sky, its pale light streaming through the tall windows of the drawing room. Inside, the atmosphere was somber, a quiet resolve settling over the space like the stillness before a storm. Hercule Poirot stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the fire flicker in the hearth. The flames danced, casting warm hues across his sharp features, but it was clear that the warmth of the fire did little to soothe the tension in the air. The revelation of the box's secrets had shaken everyone present, but the hardest truth of all was the one that had yet to be fully grasped. They were all entangled in a much darker scheme than they had ever imagined. The guests had settled into their places, each of them lost in thought, their faces reflecting a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and fear. Richard Valmont, the artist, sat stiffly in a chair, his eyes vacant, as if trying to distance himself from the chaos of the past few days. Clarissa, his wife, stood near the window, her fingers lightly touching the glass as she stared out into the darkness. Her face was pale, her expression distant, as if she were contemplating something far more profound than the present moment. And Mrs. Hartley, her face drawn and weary, was seated near the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames as though searching for some kind of answer within them. Poirot's gaze swept over them all, his mind working methodically through the tangled web of secrets they had unwittingly become a part of. The truth had been revealed in pieces, but each new revelation only deepened the mystery. The society that had once controlled the box, the twisted motives that had led to its passing between hands, the betrayal that had torn through each of their lives, these were the things that lingered in the air, thick and heavy. Yet despite the weight of it all, Poirot remained calm, resolute. He knew that the next step would be the final one. The last thread of the puzzle was within reach, and he would not rest until the truth was fully uncovered. Clarissa broke the silence first, her voice soft but filled with an underlying tension. "Poirot," she began, her gaze finally turning from the window to meet his. "What happens now? We've revealed the secrets, but what can we possibly do to stop it? The society, the people behind all of this, they won't just let us walk away." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "Madame, the greatest power we have is not in fleeing from the truth, but in confronting it. The society may believe they control the box, but they do not control you. The choice is yours now. You must choose whether to keep running from the past or whether to face it head on." Clarissa hesitated, her fingers twitching nervously at her side, but her eyes never left Poirot. I don't know if I can," she whispered. "Richard and we're in too deep. The things we've been a part of, the things we've done." Poirot stepped closer to her, his voice gentle but resolute. "You have made mistakes, yes, but those mistakes do not define you. It is what you do next that matters. You can choose to step out of the shadows and reclaim your lives, but that choice will not come easily. It will require courage, and it will require you to trust in the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." The room fell silent once more, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. Richard Valmont, who had been quietly listening, shifted in his chair, his hands clenched tightly together. "And what about the box?" he asked, his voice strained, his eyes shadowed with fear. "What happens to it now? Can we even destroy it? Can we make it disappear? Or is it already too late?" Poirot's gaze shifted toward Richard, his expression unreadable. "The box is a symbol, Monsieur Valmont. A symbol of power and control, yes, but also of a burden that no one should carry. It is not the box that holds the real power. It is the choices we make with it. You must understand that the box is not an end in itself. It is a means, a tool used by those who wish to manipulate and deceive." Richard's face twisted with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. "But the society will never let go of it," he insisted. "They'll come for it. They'll come for all of us." Poirot's voice was calm, yet carried an undeniable weight. "Then we must make sure they do not succeed. You must decide whether you will continue to live in fear, hiding behind the box, or whether you will stand and fight for what is right." The fire in the hearth crackled again, sending a burst of warmth through the room, but the warmth seemed to have little effect on the guests. They were caught between the past and the future, between what they had done and what they could still do. The choices before them were immense, and the burden of those choices lay heavy on each of their shoulders. Mrs. Hartley, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "Poirot," she said, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that had been missing for days, "I have spent so much of my life hiding from the past, trying to protect myself, my family, from the consequences of what was done long before I was born. But I cannot run anymore. I cannot keep pretending that it will all go away if I ignore it. If we are to stop this madness, we must face the truth together. All of us." Poirot smiled gently, his eyes full of understanding. "Madame Hartley," he said softly, "you have taken the first step toward freedom. Now, you must help the others find their way out of the shadows." As Poirot spoke these words, a calm resolve began to settle in the room. The tension was still there, but it had shifted. The guests, Richard, Clarissa, and Mrs. Hartley, had all been drawn into a web of lies, but they now stood at a crossroads. They could choose to continue to live in fear, hiding from the consequences of their actions, or they could take control of their own fate, confront the truth, and put an end to the dangerous forces that had held them captive for so long. For the first time since the mystery had begun, Poirot felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The truth was within their reach. It was no longer just about the box. It was about their lives, their choices, and the power they held to change their own futures. The path ahead would not be easy, and there would be many dangers along the way. But Poirot knew that the light of truth would guide them forward. And in the end, it would be the truth that set them free. The fire continued to crackle in the hearth, its warmth now more symbolic than ever. The shadows in the room seemed to recede, and the soft light from the flames illuminated the faces of those gathered, each one now standing at the threshold of a new beginning. The quiet resolve that had settled over them was not just a momentary feeling. It was the first step in a new chapter, one where the truth would no longer be hidden, and the darkness of the past would finally give way to the light of a new, unburdened future. Chapter 9. The Last Whisper. The soft glow of dawn had begun to filter through the tall windows of Hartley House, casting pale streaks of light across the polished floors and ancient furniture. The fire in the hearth, once roaring, had settled into a quiet flicker, the warmth of its embers now a distant memory in the cool morning air. Yet despite the serenity of the scene, the drawing room was thick with tension, the kind that comes only when a mystery reaches its final moments, when the answers are within reach but still tantalizingly out of grasp. Hercule Poirot stood near the window, his back to the room, gazing out at the estate's expansive grounds. The night had been long, filled with quiet conversations and intense revelations. His mind, sharp as always, had worked tirelessly through the events of the past days, piecing together the final threads of the puzzle. He had known from the very first moment he set foot in Hartley House that the truth would come in stages, and each piece of the mystery would bring them closer to the heart of the story. But now, with everything on the table, the question was no longer one of discovery. It was one of resolution. The guests, now fully aware of the gravity of their situation, had remained largely silent since the last confrontation. Richard Valmont, the artist, sat in the same chair he had occupied for much of the investigation, his eyes staring at nothing in particular, his mind seemingly far away. Clarissa Valmont, her face pale and drawn, was seated beside him, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap as she gazed out the window, lost in her own thoughts. Mrs. Hartley, who had once seemed like the pillar of control, now seemed smaller, her frame hunched as if the weight of the truth was pressing down on her. Poirot turned slowly from the window, his face serene, his expression calm, yet piercing. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the weariness of the guests, the uncertainty that lingered in the air. They had come this far. Now it was time to finish what had begun. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice gentle yet filled with the quiet authority that had guided him through countless mysteries. "The time has come. The shadows have long since been lifted, and we stand in the light of truth. But there is one final step to take." Mrs. Hartley, her hands clasped in front of her, met his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes now, just an acceptance of what must be done. "Yes, Poirot," she said softly. "I know. I have known for some time that this moment would come, that we would have to face what we've hidden for so long." Poirot nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer before turning to the others. "The secrets of this house, of your family, have been buried deep. The box, the cipher, the society, it was all a part of a much larger plan. But now, the final piece remains. The one thing you must all understand before we move forward. The room was still, each person hanging on his every word. Poirot's eyes flickered briefly to Richard, then to Clarissa, before settling once more on Mrs. Hartley. "The box is not just a symbol of power, madame," he continued, his voice low but filled with undeniable conviction. "It is a trap, a device used to ensnare those who would seek to control it. The society, they have used you all as pawns in a much greater game. But it is not too late. You have the power to make the final decision." Richard shifted in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "But we've already done so much, Poirot. How can we change anything now?" His voice trembled, as if the weight of their involvement in the mystery was too much to bear. Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "It is never too late, Monsieur Valmont. What you have done, what you have hidden, cannot be undone. But what you do next, that is what will determine your future." Clarissa's voice, barely a whisper, cut through the heavy silence. "And what do you want us to do, Poirot?" Her question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through: the fear, the deception, the guilt. Poirot took a step closer to them, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "The choice is yours," he said softly, his words deliberate. "You can allow the past to continue controlling you, hiding behind lies, or you can take control. The truth has been revealed. The shadows are gone. Now, it is time to act." Mrs. Hartley stood slowly, her expression steady, though her hands trembled ever so slightly. "What must we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Poirot turned toward the fire, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. He paused, as though gathering his thoughts before speaking. "You must destroy the box. Destroy the symbol of the power that has kept you all in its grip. The society can no longer control you. You hold the power now, madame." The room seemed to hold its breath. The guests looked at each other, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. The decision was theirs to make. The box, the cipher, the society, all of it had been part of a dark game, one that had been played for far too long. But now, they could choose to end it, to break free from the chains that had bound them for so long. Clarissa's eyes flickered with doubt, but she turned to her husband. Richard, his face pale and lined with the strain of their shared guilt, nodded slowly. I agree," he said, his voice heavy. "It's the only way. We have to end it." Mrs. Hartley took a deep breath, then stepped forward, her decision made. "Then it is done," she said, her voice strong. "I will not hide from the truth any longer. We will destroy the box." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You have made the right choice, madame. But remember this: your greatest power lies not in what you destroy, but in what you choose to rebuild." As the words settled into the room, Poirot turned toward the fire once more, his gaze distant but steady. The truth had come full circle. The game was over, and now it was time for them all to move forward. The past could no longer control them, for they had chosen their own path. Mrs. Hartley, Richard, and Clarissa stood together, the weight of their decision heavy but resolute. The box, the cipher, the society, it was all part of a history that was now behind them. And as they turned to leave the drawing room, they knew that they were no longer prisoners of the past. The shadows had been dispelled, and they were free to face the future. For Hercule Poirot, the case had come to an end. The mystery was solved. But as he stood there, watching them leave, he knew that the real journey had just begun, for them and for him. The whispers of the past had been silenced, but the echoes would linger in the quiet corners of their lives, reminding them always of the choice they had made. The fire crackled one last time, the warmth from its dying embers the only light in the room. And with that, Poirot too turned and walked into the night, his mind already turning toward the next puzzle, the next mystery that awaited him. Chapter 10. A Legacy of Ciphers. The house was quiet now. The final echoes of footsteps had faded away, and the guests had returned to their own lives, their fates sealed by the choices they had made. The air inside Hartley House felt different, lighter, as though the weight of generations of secrets had finally been lifted. Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, the moonlight now casting a serene glow over the vast grounds. But inside, the drawing room remained still, the lingering tension replaced by a deep, almost palpable sense of resolution. Hercule Poirot stood by the window, gazing out into the night, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. The fire had long since burned out, its embers now reduced to little more than glowing remnants of warmth. In the stillness of the room, Poirot allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The case, so long and so tangled, had come to its natural conclusion. But as always, the detective's mind never truly stopped. He had solved the puzzle, yes, but it was the journey, the process of uncovering the truth, that always left him with more questions than answers. In the calm of the room, Poirot reflected on the events that had transpired. The society, the box, the cipher, it had all led them here. The society, which had once been shrouded in mystery, had crumbled under the weight of its own secrecy. The box, which had once held so much power, was no longer a symbol of control. And the cipher, that delicate, intricate code that had led them through the twists and turns of the mystery, had revealed its final secret. But what lingered in Poirot's mind was not the solution itself, but the legacy of the events that had unfolded. The truth, once hidden for so long, had finally been exposed. But at what cost? Richard and Clarissa, freed from the grip of the society's manipulation, had chosen to rebuild their lives, but the shadows of their past would always remain, lurking just behind the surface of their future. Mrs. Hartley, too, had found the courage to confront the truth, but the weight of her family's history would never fully be erased. Poirot turned away from the window, his gaze now sweeping across the empty room. The final chapter had closed, but something within him stirred, a reminder that mysteries were never truly over. There were always more questions to be asked, more truths to uncover. And in this case, the most important question had yet to be fully answered. What would become of the box, now that its power had been neutralized? What would become of the legacy of the society, which had manipulated so many lives for so long? He walked toward the fireplace, where the remnants of the fire still glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the walls. The room felt different now, quieter, as though the echoes of the past had finally been silenced. And yet, as Poirot stood there, he couldn't help but feel that there was still one last thing to be done, one final piece of the puzzle to be put in place. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Poirot turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he approached the door. He had been expecting this in a way. There was always one more step, one last conversation that needed to be had before the mystery was truly over. He opened the door to find Mrs. Hartley standing in the doorway, her expression calm but serious. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of something deeper in her eyes. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for uncovering the truth, for helping us see the way forward. But there is something else I must tell you." Poirot gestured for her to enter, and she stepped into the room, her eyes glancing briefly at the fireplace before settling on him. She hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. "I've been thinking a great deal about everything that has happened," she continued, her voice quiet but firm. "About my family's history, about the society, and about the box. And I've come to a conclusion, Poirot, a conclusion that I must share with you, because it's something that may affect all of us." Poirot's curiosity piqued, and he motioned for her to continue. "Please, madame, what is it that concerns you?" Mrs. Hartley took a deep breath, her gaze focused on the floor for a moment before she looked up, meeting Poirot's eyes. "The cipher, Poirot," she said. "The final piece of the puzzle, the one that you solved, the one that opened the door to the truth. It was never meant to be solved. It was never meant to be uncovered. It was a warning, a final safeguard." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in her words. "A safeguard? But madam, the cipher led us to the truth. There was nothing hidden behind it, except the power to break the society's hold." Mrs. Hartley nodded slowly, her face somber. "Yes, but that was only part of it. The cipher itself was only a key. The true message was hidden deeper, in the pattern of the code itself. If you look at the cipher one more time, Poirot, really look at it, you will see that there's more to it than meets the eye. There's a second layer, a hidden meaning that was never meant to be revealed." Poirot's mind raced, his sharp intellect already turning over the possibilities. "A second layer?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of anticipation. "But madam, we have already examined the cipher in great detail. What could be left?" Mrs. Hartley stepped forward, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small folded piece of paper. She handed it to Poirot, her hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "Here," she said. "This is the key to the next part of the puzzle. The cipher was not just a message. It was a map, Poirot. A map that leads to something far more dangerous than we realized." Poirot took the paper from her, unfolding it with a practiced hand. His eyes scanned the new set of symbols, the intricately woven lines of the code. And as he studied it, a realization hit him with the force of a sudden storm. The cipher was more than just a key. It was a map to something buried, something that had been hidden for centuries, something that had never been meant to see the light of day. "It seems, madame," Poirot said softly, his voice now filled with quiet determination, "that this mystery is far from over. The society may have crumbled, but their legacy, what they left behind, is still very much alive." Mrs. Hartley's face tightened with resolve. "I feared as much," she said quietly, "and that is why I have come to you, Poirot, to ask for your help. We need to find what they left behind before it falls into the wrong hands." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind already shifting into its next phase of action. "We will, madame, but this time we must be careful. We will follow the map, piece by piece, and ensure that the legacy of the society remains buried for good." As Poirot looked at the paper in his hands, the weight of the mystery deepened. The truth had been revealed, yes, but it was clear now that the final chapter was yet to be written. The shadows of the past were not yet gone. And as always, Poirot would be there to uncover the next layer, to chase the truth wherever it led, even if it meant delving deeper into the darkness than ever before. For the first time, Poirot allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The game was not over, and he would see it through to the end.